Hello, let's discuss the internal carotid system of the brain. So, as you all know that the brain is supplied by the two system. One is the internal carotid system containing the internal carotid artery. This is internal carotid artery coming from the common carotid artery, and the other is vertebro-basilar system. Vertebro-basilar system consists of vertebral artery and two basilar artery. Okay, so we will in this lecture we will discuss about the internal carotid system. Okay, so this is the internal carotid system. Okay, internal carotid system consists of internal carotid artery. Okay, so we will discuss about the origin of the internal carotid artery, the course, its parts, and the termination of the internal carotid artery. So internal carotid artery originate from the common carotid artery as one of its terminal branch. Okay, so the common carotid artery at the upper border of the thyroid cartilage. This is thyroid cartilage at the C3 C4 level. Okay, at the C3 C4 level and at the upper border of the thyroid cartilage, the common carotid artery bifurcates into two main branches. One is internal carotid artery and the other one is external carotid artery. Okay, external carotid artery and internal carotid artery. The internal carotid artery gives blood supply to the brain structures. Okay, so the internal carotid artery has the course of the internal carotid artery consists of four parts. First, it runs upward in the neck, then it goes into the petrous part of the temporal bone, then in the cavernous sinus, and then after the cavernous sinus it enters into brain. Okay, so at the level of the optic chiasm it terminates into its two branches. Okay, so the internal, this is the part which runs in the neck. It is the cervical part. This part runs in the this one, it runs in the petrous part of the temporal bone, so it is called petrous part of the internal carotid artery, while this one is this is cavernous sinus. Okay, this blue structure is cavernous sinus, and inside the cavernous sinus there is a cavernous part of the internal carotid artery, and above the cavernous sinus there is supracavernous part of the internal carotid artery, and then at the level of the optic chiasm it bifurcates into its two branches. Middle cerebral artery, the which gives the major blood supply, arterial supply to the brain, and the smaller branch, terminal branch is anterior cerebral artery. Okay, so the two terminal branches of the internal carotid artery is middle cerebral artery and anterior cerebral artery. So in this diagram the four parts of the internal carotid artery. This is internal carotid artery. Okay, and this is the part which runs or travels in the neck region. This is the cervical part of the internal carotid artery up to this one. Then it enter into petrous part of the temporal bone, this part up to here. Okay, this is second part which is called petrous part of the internal carotid artery, and the third part runs inside the cavernous sinus, and this is the cavernous part of the temporal bone. Okay, so the cavernous part of the cavernous, not temporal bone, cavernous part of the internal carotid artery. We are talking about internal carotid artery. Then above the cavernous sinus there is fourth part which is the cerebral part of the internal carotid artery, or we can say the supracavernous part of the internal carotid artery. Okay, so this, the last one is cerebral part of the internal carotid artery. and this yellow structure is optic chiasm, and at the level of the optic chiasm it terminates into its two branches. One is the middle cerebral artery, this large one is middle cerebral artery, and this one is the interior cerebral artery. The middle cerebral artery is the major arterial blood supply of the brain. Okay, it gives major portion of the arterial supply to the brain. So middle cerebral artery is one of the terminal branch of the internal carotid artery, and the other terminal branch is this interior cerebral artery. So interior, the two sides, both of the interior cerebral artery from the left and the right side goes upward, and it is communicated or connected through the interior communicating artery. Okay, so this is pre-communicating part of the interior cerebral artery, and this one is post communicating part of the interior cerebral artery. Okay, so these are the parts of the internal carotid artery. Now this is the common carotid artery. Okay, this is common carotid artery, and at the level of the upper border of the thyroid cartilage, at the level of C3 and C4 cervical vertebra, it terminates into its two main branches, or it bifurcates into two main branches. The external carotid artery, this is external carotid artery, this one, and this one is internal carotid artery. Now this part is the cervical part of the internal carotid artery. This small one is the petrous part of the internal carotid artery. This one, okay, this is the cavernous part of the internal carotid artery, and this last part is the supracavernous part of the internal carotid. Then it terminates into its two branches. This one is interior cerebral artery, okay, and the large one, this one is middle cerebral artery. Okay, the interior cerebral artery of both sides communicate with each other through interior communicating artery. Okay, so this is the internal carotid system, its origin, its course, and its parts, and its termination. It terminates at the level of the optic chiasm. Okay, so this is the internal carotid system. The same is present on the other side also. Okay, now this is the inferior view of the inferior view. Okay, so this is the vertebro-basilar system containing vertebral artery and the basilar artery and its branches. Okay, so you can see this is the internal carotid artery, the cut end of the internal carotid artery, and upon reaching to this structure, which is optic chiasm, it bifurcates into its two main branches. The smaller one is this one, interior cerebral artery, and the larger one is this one, middle cerebral arteries. Okay, so this middle cerebral artery runs in the lateral sulcus, while the interior cerebral artery runs just above the optic chiasm in the callosal sulcus. Okay, so this is the interior and middle cerebral artery of the internal carotid artery. This picture also shows the internal carotid artery, and this is the cut end of the internal carotid artery. It bifurcates into this one, which is interior cerebral artery. Okay, this is the interior communicating artery, and this large one is middle cerebral artery. Okay, now we will talk about the branches from the internal carotid artery. So internal carotid artery gives four branches. The first one is this ophthalmic artery. Okay, this is internal carotid artery. It terminates into two branches. This is interior cerebral artery. Okay, and this is the middle cerebral artery. This is the interior cerebral artery before communication, pre-communicating part of interior cerebral artery, and this is the post-communicating part of the interior cerebral artery, and this is interior communicating artery, the connection between the two interior cerebral artery. So the branches, we are talking about four branches of the internal carotid artery. So the first one, this is ophthalmic artery. Okay, then the hypophyseal artery. These are the hypophyseal arteries, superior hypophyseal arteries and inferior hypophyseal artery. So the second branch is hypophyseal arteries. The third one is this artery, which is posterior communicating artery, and it connects the internal carotid artery with the posterior cerebral artery. This is the posterior cerebral artery from one side and posterior cerebral artery of the other side. So the posterior cerebral artery is one of the terminal branch of the posterior cerebral artery. So the basilar artery terminates into two posterior cerebral artery, and this posterior communicating artery connects the internal carotid system or internal carotid artery with the posterior cerebral artery or vertebro-basilar system. Okay, so this is about the posterior communicating artery. The fourth branch is this one, which is anterior choroidal artery. Okay, so the posterior communicating artery gives innervation to the midbrain. Okay, this gives branches to the midbrain, the internal capsule, the thalamus and the hypothalamus, while the interior choroidal artery give branches to the internal capsule, choroidal plexus of the lateral ventricle, caudate nucleus, optic tract and amygdala. Okay, so this is the arterial, while the ophthalmic artery gives branches to the eyeball. Okay, and the orbit, it gives branches to the orbit. Okay, and this is the superior hypophyseal artery and inferior hypophyseal. It gives innervation or branches to the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. Okay, this structure is optic chiasm. Okay, so at the level of the, you can see that at the level of the optic chiasm, this internal carotid artery divides into the middle cerebral artery and the interior cerebral artery, and then interior cerebral artery goes upward to connect with each other through interior communicating artery. Okay, this picture also shows some of the branches of the internal carotid artery. This is the hypophyseal artery, superior hypophyseal artery and inferior hypophyseal artery. This one is posterior communicating artery, and it connects internal carotid artery with the posterior cerebral artery. Okay, so the posterior cerebral artery comes from the basilar artery. Okay, the terminal branches of the basilar artery is two posterior cerebral arteries. Okay, so this is about the internal carotid system and its branches and in its terminal branches and its course. Now we will talk about the location of the interior cerebral artery, which is one of the terminal branch of internal carotid, and middle cerebral artery and posterior cerebral artery. So you can see this system, which is called circle of Willis. Okay, so it has three main contribution: from the posterior cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery and interior cerebral artery. So the interior cerebral artery, you can see this is the location of the interior cerebral artery. It is located just above the corpus callosum in the callosal sulcus. Okay, so you can better view this interior cerebral artery in the medial view. This is medial surface of the brain. Okay, and at the medial you can see the corpus callosum, and at the upper border of the corpus callosum in the callosal surface, sulcus, there is interior cerebral artery. Okay, so interior cerebral artery is one of the terminal branch of the internal carotid artery, and it runs in the callosal sulcus just above the corpus callosum. This is medial view of the brain. Okay, now this is the lateral view of the brain. Okay, lateral view of the brain. Why it is lateral view of the brain? Because there is lateral sulcus. So this is lateral sulcus, and in the lateral sulcus there is this big artery which is middle cerebral artery, one of the terminal branch of the internal carotid artery. Okay, so this is the lateral surface, and in the lateral surface there is lateral sulcus, in which there is middle cerebral artery, while the posterior cerebral artery, this one is posterior cerebral artery, and it runs in the calcarine sulcus. Okay, so posterior cerebral artery in calcarine sulcus, middle cerebral artery in the lateral sulcus, while the interior cerebral artery is in the callosal sulcus just above the corpus callosum. You can see this is corpus callosum, and just above the corpus callosum is callosal sulcus, in which there is location of the interior cerebral artery. Okay, so now we will talk about the areas which gives which is innervated by the interior cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery, and posterior cerebral artery. So these are the three main branches, arterial branches, which supplies the brain. Okay, so interior and middle cerebral artery comes from the internal carotid artery. Okay, while the posterior cerebral artery come from the basilar artery. Okay, so this view is lateral view. Okay, because there is lateral sulcus. This is lateral sulcus. So in this is the area which is supplied by interior cerebral artery, upper part of the frontal lobe, parietal lobe. Okay, while this is the area which is supplied by the middle cerebral artery, lower part of the frontal, parietal lobe, and temporal lobe, while this is the supply of the posterior cerebral artery, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe, part of the temporal lobe. Now this is the medial view of the brain, and this pink area you can see, orange area, it is the area which is supplied by interior cerebral artery. Okay, so the medial surface or medial part of the frontal lobe and parietal lobe is supplied by interior cerebral artery. Now this is the posterior cerebral artery, green area, occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe, and this shows the medial cerebral artery, a medial part, small medial part of the temporal lobe, which is supplied by a middle cerebral artery. Now this is the inferior view. Okay, inferior view of the brain, and this yellow area is supplied by the middle cerebral artery, major part of the forebrain and parietal the major part of the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, while this small area is supplied by the interior cerebral artery, and the whole occipital lobe is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery, along with the small part of the temporal lobe. Okay, so this is the blood supply of the brain, and this we discuss about the internal carotid artery and internal carotid system. Okay,